From 1962 to 1992, Johnny Carson ruled the American living room. Every evening, he sat behind that sleek desk, radiating poise, wit, and a barely contained smirk that could defuse almost any disaster. But even Carson, the king of cool, had nights where the champagne flowed a little too freely, and his guests, well, they came on stage in a state somewhere between tipsy charm and public intoxication. What made these moments unforgettable wasn't the drunkenness itself, it was how Carson handled them. His mastery of timing, restraint, and razor-sharp wit turned what could have been career-ending fiascos into some of the most talked-about moments in live television history. So tonight, we're counting down the 8 most drunk Johnny Carson guests of all time, the ones who slurred, stumbled, and shocked America, and somehow made late-night history in the process. Number 8. Truman Capote, the genius who lost his grip. Few names carried more prestige and eccentric brilliance than Truman Capote, the literary icon behind Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. But one fateful night on The Tonight Show, Capote's sharp tongue was dulled by one too many martinis. Carson had invited Capote to discuss his new book, an appearance meant to remind America of his literary genius. But when the cameras rolled, it was immediately clear that Capote was not sober. His once crisp diction dissolved into slurred monologues, punctuated by long, uncomfortable pauses. At first, Carson tried to guide him, tossing him easy questions, smiling politely. But as Capote began mumbling about his dear friends in high society and certain parties in Kansas, the host realized he was dealing with a spectacle. Viewers didn't know whether to laugh or cringe. Some saw tragedy, a fallen genius unraveling in real time. Others couldn't look away. Carson, ever the gentleman, ended the interview early, thanking Capote for his colorful perspective. The next day, newspapers described it as television's most excruciating 5 minutes. Capote, humiliated, never returned to Carson's couch. It was one of the earliest moments that proved The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was live, unpredictable human theater. Number 7, Oliver Reed, the British Tornado. If there was ever a man who embodied brilliant chaos, it was Oliver Reed, the hard-drinking British actor known for The Three Musketeers and Gladiator. When Reed appeared on Carson's show, everyone backstage knew trouble was brewing. He had been seen polishing off 2 bottles of wine before the cameras rolled. Still, Carson, ever the optimist, welcomed him warmly. The audience roared when Reed swaggered in, shirt half unbuttoned, grinning like a pirate. "Johnny, my boy," he bellowed in that booming voice, slapping Carson's hand. The host's eyes widened. This was going to be a long night. Reed began with stories about sword fighting and drinking contests that would make sailors blush. But as the alcohol took hold, his tales turned increasingly incoherent. He challenged Carson to an arm wrestling match, then serenaded the band mid-interview. At one point, he leaned in too close and slurred, "Johnny, I love ya, mate. You're the only sober one here." The crowd laughed nervously. Carson, maintaining perfect composure, turned to the camera and deadpanned, "Well, someone has to drive the show home." The line saved the segment, pure Carson magic. What could have been a train wreck became an instant classic. But NBC producers later admitted they nearly cut the episode entirely. Oliver Reed, of course, shrugged off the criticism. "I wasn't drunk," he said afterward. "I was celebrating life." And for those who saw it live, that celebration was something they'd never forget. Number 6, Shelley Winters, the hurricane in human form. Actress Shelley Winters was a Hollywood force, brilliant, fiery, and famously unpredictable. When she walked onto Carson's stage, The Tonight Show was no longer a polite conversation. It was a storm. Winters had been drinking backstage, reportedly a mix of vodka and orange juice for nerves. By the time she sat down, she was animated, loud, and ready for confrontation. Carson began gently, asking about her latest film. But Winters wasn't there to talk about cinema, she was there to perform. Within minutes, she began venting about Hollywood's double standards for women, calling producers clowns in tuxedos. The audience laughed uneasily as Carson tried to steer her back on track. Then came the infamous moment. Shelley grabbed her drink, took a long gulp, and splashed a few drops onto Johnny's suit jacket. "You need a drink, Johnny," she exclaimed. The studio gasped. Carson froze, then slowly looked down at his drenched sleeve. Without missing a beat, he smiled and said, "Well, that's the first time anyone's tried to water me on national television." The crowd erupted. Winters laughed hysterically, kissed him on the cheek, and stumbled off stage after the segment ended. For years, that clip circulated as proof that no one could rattle Johnny Carson, not even Shelley Winters at full throttle. Number 5, Dean Martin, the king of controlled chaos. When you think of alcohol and charm, one name stands above them all: Dean Martin. The Rat Pack legend was known for his smooth voice, sharp wit, and ever-present glass of bourbon. But here's the secret. Most of the time, that bourbon was iced tea. Dean Martin wasn't always the drunk he played on stage, except for one memorable night with Johnny Carson. On that night, the line between act and reality blurred. Dean showed up, visibly buzzed, his tie loose, eyes twinkling with mischief. He leaned into the camera and said, "Johnny, I'm not drunk, I'm just rehearsing." The audience howled. But as the interview went on, Martin's timing, usually flawless, began to lag. He forgot his punchlines, tripped over Carson's questions, and at one point declared, "I've got a great joke. I just can't remember it." Carson, quick as ever, replied, "That's all right, Dean. We'll just wait till the rerun." The studio went wild. It was a rare glimpse of the man behind the legend, still charming, but human, even in his haze. Dean Martin managed to make being drunk look like an art form. By the end of the segment, he hugged Carson and whispered, "You're the best straight man I've ever had." Carson smiled, leaned into the mic, and said, "I've been called worse." That line cemented the moment. Two masters of timing, one sober, one decidedly not, sharing live television that felt alive. Number 4, Richard Burton, the poet of the pint. Few actors commanded language like Richard Burton. His voice alone could fill a theater. But behind that thunderous baritone was a man perpetually at war with the bottle. Burton's appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 70s was meant to promote a Shakespeare revival. Instead, it became one of the most chaotic interviews of Carson's career. When Burton arrived, he was polite, articulate, and, according to crew members, already 4 whiskeys deep. As the cameras rolled, his sentences began to meander into poetic rambling. He quoted Hamlet, misquoted Dylan Thomas, and finally raised his glass and declared, "To hell with critics, let's drink to the audience." Carson, keeping his poker face, clinked glasses with him and replied, "I'll drink to your audience, Richard, but I think mine's getting nervous." The laughter broke the tension, but the damage was done. Burton's publicist begged NBC not to re-air the segment. Still, it remains one of the most talked-about Tonight Show appearances in history, a mix of brilliance and breakdown that perfectly captured Burton's tragic magnetism. Number 3, Peter O'Toole, the charmer with a whiskey soul. If alcohol had a poet laureate, it would have been Peter O'Toole. The Lawrence of Arabia legend was known for his towering performances, his razor wit, and his legendary capacity for whiskey. When O'Toole sat down on The Tonight Show in the mid-70s, the audience was ecstatic. He was in his prime, tall, eloquent, and glowing with that mischievous Irish energy that made him impossible not to love. Carson chuckled, shaking his head. He knew exactly how to play the rhythm, giving O'Toole space to shine, then pulling him back from the edge with a perfectly timed question. By the end, both men were laughing, the crowd was howling, and the world remembered why Peter O'Toole was the most charming rogue Hollywood ever produced. That interview wasn't a disaster. It was performance art, and Carson, ever the conductor, made sure the symphony ended on just the right note. Number 2, Foster Brooks, the man who played drunk too well. Foster Brooks was unlike anyone else on this list because his drunkenness was an act. A comedian by trade, Brooks made a career out of pretending to be plastered. His lovable lush character became a nationwide hit, a parody of inebriation, so convincing that millions believed it was real. When Brooks appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson always played along, and the results were pure comedic genius. One particular night, though, things got confusing. Brooks stumbled on stage, hiccuped his way to the couch, and began slurring about being an airline pilot who might have landed on the wrong runway. The audience was in hysterics, but a few minutes in, it became clear that this time, Brooks had actually been drinking before the show. His act was suddenly a little too authentic. Number 1, Ed McMahon, the wingman who couldn't stay sober. And finally, the most iconic drunk of the Tonight Show wasn't a guest at all. It was Ed McMahon, Johnny Carson's loyal sidekick for 3 decades. To the audience, McMahon was the booming laugh, the here's Johnny announcer, and the eternal good sport who could make any guest feel welcome. But behind the scenes, Ed had a reputation for enjoying his drink, sometimes a little too much. On most nights, it was harmless fun, a few cocktails before airtime, a steady buzz that loosened his laugh. But there were a handful of nights when it went too far, and Carson's patience, though endless, was tested.